And while we're waiting for the last few people here to join today, just a couple quick housekeeping items. So for many of you, I'm sure you're used to using Zoom by now. There is a built-in chat function. So my goal is to make these as dynamic as possible. So any questions or comments or things that you guys want to chat about, feel free to toss it in the chat and, we'll either answer them and address them in real time, or we can kind of save them for the end for Q&A. So why don't we just go ahead and kind of get started, 'cause it leads into a couple other things. My main goal today is to talk a little bit about like operational challenges that we as both grant makers and also for some of you scholarship providers really can't afford to ignore it any longer. And I'll give a quick introduction of who I am, kind of set the stage a little bit for why we're having today's conversation. But I'm going to go ahead and drop a quick little question in the chat. And if anybody wants to offer any insights, by all means, please do. And it's kind of like, what is your own personal number one operational challenge that you're looking to solve, or things that might be impacting you? I think we'll kind of get into introductions, but a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, I think, will apply to many of you. With that said, if there's the vast majority that are kind of dealing with the same challenges or same circumstances, we can kind of shift our focus a little bit and try to offer some additional insights as we go. But my goal here today is to try to keep this to about a 30-minute conversation. And how I measure success is if you can walk away with one tangible best practice or insight that you can take and apply to your programs overnight, then I would consider that a win. So why I say that and kind of set the stage. My name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewer. Been doing this since about 2012 when we started the company. I think what makes us rather unique is that we actually built Reviewer and we named it Reviewer because that was the life that we lived. So we served as part of the volunteer review committees for all sorts of these kind of funding opportunities, scholarships, grants, you name it. And so, what our personal experience started with was paper. So, if you think through like what your current grant making or scholarship providing processes were, we would have hundreds of binders mailed to our doorstep and being said, hey, go review these, offer your feedback, and then, ship those binders back with your notes, or, show up on a Saturday for a deliberation meeting with other committee members. And then we started to live kind of that double life where organizations try to go online. And I think they did that for two main reasons. One is operationally speaking, like the processes with paper were overwhelming, they weren't sustainable. They had to create efficiency. But number two is that they're trying to elevate the experience for everybody else involved, both the applicants and then the review team. Now, the downside of that is when they started to use online tools, so built-in forms, spreadsheets, downloading of documents, emails, you name it. It did, to an extent, elevate the applicant or the grantee's experience. But operationally speaking, no longer do we have to deal with, manual paper consolidation. Now we're going to like six or seven different places. We're downloading, we're exporting, we're recompiling. So the time on task really didn't get any better. If not, it may have actually gotten worse. And then from the review team's perspective, while we didn't love the physical paper binders being mailed to us, at least they were centralized, right? Now we're going to like six or seven different tools, and we ourselves are also having to find people's packets, download them, toss our notes and our scores and our feedback in a spreadsheet, send it back, and we are also spending way more time. So we actually built Reviewer for kind of two main reasons. One is operationally, how do we elevate your guys' time so you can focus on your mission and your vision? But really, I think the core to what we want to talk about is how do we elevate the experience? And I use that term quite a bit for really everybody else involved. So what we did is we kind of audited roughly about 100 or so of the last conversations that we had, primarily with grant makers, but also some scholarship providers, to kind of really unpack like what are the core challenges more from an operation perspective that you guys are facing on a day-to-day basis. And then we'll kind of build a webinar around like what those challenges are. And then again, kind of keep it very short, concise with real tangible feedback. And also we'll kind of show you Reviewer to an extent, not necessarily to kind of show the platform, but more so to visualize those best practices and how you can apply them. And again, if you can walk away with one small takeaway or one small solution, then I think we can kind of consider this a successful conversation. So, with all that said, there was one comment that came in that as a granting organization, you're facing consistency and process for your grant committee. You're right, Rebecca. I will get to that you're not alone. So, let's go ahead and look at what some of these operational challenges are over the next five or so slides. Again, we really did a deep dive and audit of both the last 100 conversations, and we try to summarize them by category. And then we'll spend a few minutes kind of talking through some of the main bullet points on how we can start to solve some of those challenges. And your point around a consistent and engaging process for your grant committee is 100% true. I would also argue that the bulk of the feedback that we get is more centered around like, as applications come in, like what do you do with them next? How do you build these review workflows? How do you hold your review team accountable? How do you conduct a fair, non-biased selection process? How do you normalize the results because some committee members may be looking at applicants through a different lens than others, and things like that. So I think we're going to spend the majority of our time kind of on that topic here today. But I don't want to kind of underemphasize all the other components that go into kind of grant making and operations. So with all that said, the first thing is more at a high level, manual and inefficient processes, right? So I think for many of us, unless we're using a dedicated grant management software, and there's a handful of platforms out there like Reviewer, um, we're likely using potentially outdated, not very modern manual workflows. So that's again a combination of forms, PDFs, spreadsheets, Google Drive, Dropbox links, you name it. And so obviously when you kind of go down that route, your processes and your programs become kind of disconnected, data becomes very siloed. And to kind of take a step back, most of these challenges that we're going to kind of talk about are actually a byproduct of one another. So by solving one or two small things, it actually indirectly will start to solve and present opportunity for some of the other challenges that we might be running into. As much as of us, I think we're, experts with spreadsheets, and we very well may be. We need to avoid having reliance on those, especially with programs of this caliber and this important. There's way too much room for human error, data manipulation, data security and privacy, et cetera. To your point, kind of the manual judge assignments, like at its very core, taking scholarship app or grant applications in and then assigning out to your team for review is a high level, kind of a simple concept. But as we all know, like the actual day in the life isn't quite that simple. Some of you might have multiple programs, you've got different committees. You may have your staff reviewing not all applications, just a subset of them. They may be maybe multiple phases, multiple rounds. And so when you start to kind of layer on those additional complexities, that's when you take kind of a broad, high level, simple concept of taking applications and team, and it becomes a much more complex and much more robust. Um, on the review side of things, obviously, without a dedicated scoring system or a deliberation tool, often it means that we're merging files. Your team is sending you their results through email and through spreadsheets. You need to take each and every one of them, kind of export them, merge them, run your formulas, etc. And generally speaking, again, I've been doing this now for 12 years. Most of us are on smaller teams, although your organizations may be larger. The actual time and resources allocated to like the operations of this program can be quite small. And so how do we avoid you guys spending less excessive time on some of the more compiling manual work so you can focus more on your mission and your vision? So that's more of a high level kind of inefficient manual process overview. From here, we can kind of dive deeper into like the different experiences, and I'll use that term consistently. So there's kind of like three and a half experiences that go into a grant making process. You have the applicant's experience, so the submitter or the grantee. You've got the operational or the program team. You've got the review and selection committees, and then kind of that half persona that I mentioned is a combination of like your stakeholders, your board members, your community. It could be additional people helping with the application, so people submitting references, et cetera. So on the application side of things, again, these are actual notes pulled directly from conversations, so verbatim, word for word, that the user interfaces and the application process can feel clunky, not very modern. It may not be mobile friendly. There's high barrier processes, so lower participation rates. People may start your applications and then never actually finish up, things like that. You have applicants who are unable to either upload multiple files, or we live in a time now where if you take out your iPhone and record a video file, not only is it going to be gigantic, but it's going to come in like 5 different file formats. So while you may be able to take the files in, although it may kind of time out for the applicant, how do we ensure that our teams and our staff and our reviewers can actually physically access those documents and those deliverables? Some of you may actually have multiple programs or grants. Each one of them will have different type of eligibility criteria and rubrics. And so how do we kind of start to filter and vet applicants so they can't physically apply if they're not eligible, wasting their time and your time? And then of course, from a communication perspective, right? Unless you have a process where all the data lives together, it makes follow-ups and automation and communication very, very challenging. This kind of goes hand in hand, so lack of a centralized system, right? So anytime we're starting to live in forms, spreadsheets, email, Dropbox, you name it, data becomes very siloed, becomes very disconnected. So I would argue that this is the number one challenge to solve because again, all the other elements are a byproduct of not having kind of all of your content and workflows and processes centralized in one spot for the entire grand scheme of the program. I think we often think through a grant as like a point A to point Z. Point A is like the open call for applications or LOIs. Point Z, I guess in theory, could be the selection or the funding side of things. But kind of the magic happens and really the work happens between points B and point Y. So managing the intake, communicating with people, building out these dashboards, impact tracking, measurements, things like that. The next thing we'll look at here is the review and judges. So I already kind of high level alluded to this. Right now, one of the biggest challenges with the review process is a lack of consistency. And that's kind of using your question that you left in the chat, where if I'm an evaluator and I'm being asked to go look at these 20 applications or these 20 submissions, like how do you ensure that I'm kind of looking at it through the same lens as my other evaluators? Are we using rubrics? Are we using scorecards? How do I identify if Kyle, the evaluator, is just more strict than, say, for example, Susie? And if that is the case and we're not reviewing the same applications, how do you not penalize or reward a grant applicant by getting kind of the short stick of the straw? It also can be very challenging when you've got a lot of data that your review team has to look at. So not just application forms, but file uploads, communication from your staff. How do you kind of, so I'm a father of two, and if you ask me to help you review your applications, I'm generally going to be doing this at like 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night on a Wednesday. So these are life-changing opportunities. We owe it to our applicants for the review team to allocate the time and energy that they deserve from us. But at the same time, a lot of times these evaluators and these reviewers are volunteers and they've got other obligations. So how do we put them into a position for success where they can allocate the time that's required from them, but also provide like the most qualitative, thoughtful reviews as possible in order for you guys to make the most proper selections that you have. And then the last piece here is going to be reporting. So again, this is without a doubt the number one byproduct of all the other things that we talked about, being able to kind of go back in time and start to aggregate and consolidate and build reports on the demographic of applicants that you have, where people are at within their processes, being able to send reminder messages. And then for me, it's that last bullet, which is actually challenges and measuring the true program impact that you're having. Many of us are funded organizations. Either we raise funds ourselves, we might be getting grants from other entities. And so how do we kind of go back at the end of the year to our stakeholders and to our donors and to our teams and say, look, this is our mission, this is our vision. We set out to launch this grant program to do X, Y, Z. And do we actually hold ourselves accountable by achieving our mission? And it's a kind of we have to look at ourselves in the mirror a little bit and, be truthful in making those comments, but you have to have the data at your hands and be able to generate reports very, very quickly to equip you with that kind of battle plan or that kind of scorecard to go back to your stakeholders and say, here's the people we funded, here's how much we funded them for, and here's the real impact that we had on them, their communities, or whoever your kind of demographic is. So with all that said, oh, I guess the last slide here is data security and compliance, right? So we'll kind of come back to this, but we live in a time now where I think people are much more aware and vulnerable to where they're submitting stuff. So if you're collecting tax documentation or financials or budgets, how do we ensure that it's being stored in a very safe, secure manner? AKA, we can't have things being downloaded and exported and then put into spreadsheets or emails. And then number two is how do we control access levels? Like who actually can physically access that? And I actually go a step further. I would say like the redaction of data from review staff members. Sometimes they're collecting very personal information, PII, demographics that maybe we don't realize it, but could have a negative impact on how they view the applicant. And so if that is the case, how do we kind of ease the mind of the submitter that information won't be used against them or for them, right? So things like that. So let's kind of go through step by step some of these key experiences. And we're going to talk about four of them: application, operation, review, and then truthfully measuring impact. I appreciate the comment in there about kind of the challenge that you're facing. We'll cover that one. If there's other challenges that you guys are being kind of tasked with that you're trying to solve, please do toss them in the chat and we'll try to kind of incorporate them as we go. So number one is going to be streamlining the application intake. And again, the entire concept here is they all work hand in hand, right? So if you don't streamline the application side of things and build a very clean workflow, then operating and kind of managing the logistics of it, doing your communication, doing your workflow management, assigning it out to the teams becomes very, very challenging. And if you can't solve those challenges, then when you go to actually conduct the review and selection process, that then becomes challenging. And then if all three of those are kind of disconnected or kind of a cluttered mess, then it becomes virtually impossible to run reports. So I want to kind of just go systematically through for like point A to point Z. And again, how do we offer small tidbits of best practices that kind of, again, influence the next steps or those next challenges that we're going to get into? So I'm not going to go too deep into the common issues. We kind of already alluded to many of these. I would argue that, we live in a time now where the applicant or the consumer has a different kind of degree of how they want to be engaged with, right? We live in a digital era where they do everything through their phones. Accessing content and forms and deliverables is more accessible than ever. We're even finding that many of them have like more complex file uploads, like budgets, on their phone. They might be building those in like Google Sheets. They can download it, they can export it. And so whenever you open your application process, like what is the end goal in mind? What data do you have to collect? Where does it live? And if you're going to be doing a press release or a marketing push or promoting your program, and the end user is already on their phone, scrolling social media at night, and they get that link, that's your chance to convert them right there. So if they're going to begin to start the process, we'll kind of get more into like tracking of people who start and never finish. We don't want them to get the email and say, great, I'll come back to this tomorrow when I'm at my computer, and then they never do. So it's all about kind of creating a very clean, modern experience. Again, your reputation and kind of your first interactions of your program happen on the application side of things, and that really does kind of set the bar in what the follow-up experience is going to look like. So very clean, very modern, very user-friendly. Again, for many of you, if you're using like built-in web forms, we use them here at Reviewer as well. It absolutely does elevate the applicant experience. However, a lot of times where those forms live and how you access that information is what impacts the operational challenges of being able to manage them. So you solve one problem, but not necessarily the rest of them. If you're having applications being emailed to you, if you're having fillable PDFs, that's where I think there's going to be a ton of value here. The number one goal in the application side of things is we have to lower the barrier. Again, these are people who are in need, they're applying for funding. We want to make success easy for them. That's like the definition of a leader is, making success easy for other people. And so how do we not over collect data? How do we create a very clean, non-messy structure? It could be as simple as breaking your grant process into two components, an LOI, so very low level energy, high level information about the applicants, doing a very quick manual brief review of them, and then deciding who's going to submit their full projects, things like that. If you are collecting data through like a Jot form or some type of online form tool or a fillable PDF, generally what that means is that you have to then go find all those applications that came in, download them, export them, and kind of recompile them into what I call like a grant packet or a grant application packet. So again, if you create the modern application structure, all that recompiling and that aggregation will happen for you. And the reason why we want to do that is to avoid having any disconnected or lost information. So not to get kind of too rambly here, but there was a conversation that we had with somebody who said, we went through an entire grant application process, we cut checks, and then 6 months later, there were a handful of applicants that reached back out to us asking for an update, and we didn't know who they were. So because of that, like we literally never even reviewed their applications. And the reason why was kind of two things happened. Number one is they're actually living in a spam filter. So they sent an email with a bunch of attached applications, or as they were downloading, exporting, and recompiling, that row in their spreadsheet was missed. So again, they went through an entire funding opportunity and they didn't even review all of the candidates who applied. So it's obviously a bad look on the organization. It's unfair to them, but it's also a potential compliance risk as well. So I'm going to kind of show you these best practices, but the goal here is to create a very clean, mobile, responsive, user-friendly, modern application process. The key takeaway here is we want to think about the application process as profile-centric. There are so many moving parts to grant management. You have people, submission forms, file uploads, communication, judging and scoring, and then kind of the lost art there is the ongoing data collection from the grantees for measuring impact. The only way that any of this can become achievable is if you have everything kind of flow back into what I call a profile. I also love the concept of a personalized experience. So for some of you that offer multiple grants, you might be wanting to collect different data points from each one of them based on the grant that they're applying for. It may be a multi-phase program where you collect some information up front and then you kind of unlock additional data or forms for them down the road. So how do you create this like application structure that they don't interact with, but instead interacts with them? So based on how their responses are and how they're interacting with the forms, it'll actually decide what data that we're going to collect. So with all that said, here's an example of what I would consider obviously in Reviewer a modern experience, but I really want to hit home that modern profile-centric approach. So the grantees or the applicants very quickly tell us who they are. This is a critical component because right now all they're doing is telling us who they are and then beginning their application journey. However, every single follow-up activity that happens, file uploads, forms, communication, notes, all gets logged on that initial profile. So while it starts quite small, it's going to grow and grow until it holds literally everything about them. So now, kind of bigger picture, when you go to do the reviews, you're no longer taking data and sharing it with your team. You're taking people, because that's what these are, people and organizations. Also, from a reporting perspective, you don't have to find data from like 9 or 10 different places to be able to run reports. You just target one spot, and that's the profile. So I also talked about like these interactive personalized experiences. This may be a bit more complex than some of the grants here, but in this organization specifically, they offer like 5 or 6 different types of grants. Each one of them has very clear eligibility criteria and guidelines. So what they do is they, in theory, could ask, hey, what grant do you want to apply for? And then based on their selection, use automation to say, great, here's the form. However, what they're doing instead is building profiles. So it's a persona-based application where the applicant can actually answer a series of questions. And then based off of their answers, the system will say, great, these are the 3 opportunities that we have available that you actually align with. Which of or all of them do you want to submit for? So we're ensuring that only the eligible applicants can get through here, but also, ideally speaking, we're making opportunities that maybe previously weren't transparent or available to them now more open. And again, it's like an old 1990s Goosebumps book for those of you kind of in that demographic where you're kind of choosing your own journey. So if I choose the Lennox Wilder grant, all the subsequent steps and follow-ups and the scorecards are going to be directly tied to what I just chose here. So it's one single entry point for everybody that then starts to branch out to be very personalized based off of that opportunity. Not to get too deep into the weeds on the forms, my goal here again is that we want to lower the barrier so applicants can save, they can log out, they can come back later. Kind of a bonus tip, once you get to this point, we now know who the people are. And so from an operation perspective, you can see who started, who hasn't finished, who has finished. You can send built-in reminder messages. I think you might be shocked to see how many people start applications and either A, wait to the very last minute to submit. That may not be shocking, or who never actually follow through and finish their applications. So now that we know this, we can see who they are, how far they made it. We can start to send them reminder messages and kind of help, automate their experience. As far as actual data collection goes, the next slide we're going to talk about is more of like the document management because that can be kind of a messy situation for many. But again, it's mobile responsive. They're kind of just answering the series of questions as they go. They can save, come back later, short answers, content, essays, and then you will see within here we're starting to get into file uploads. So this could be like a spreadsheet or a budget. If I go to the next page, maybe I want to offer like additional supporting documents like projects or financial statements or whatever other kind of files or deliverables that you're requesting. Again, thinking bigger picture, we're moving into a time where multimedia is becoming a huge component. So like video essays, testimonials, whatever that might be. So if that is the case, like how do you expect them to submit those? Are those links to YouTube? Are they direct file uploads? How do we ensure that our team can actually access them? I also want to very quickly allude to references. So I'll keep this short and simple. I'm not sure how many of you are collecting like letters of recommendation or letters of support from your applicants. This can be a very, very messy situation because what happens is generally the references will come in directly from the person writing it. And so that means A, you don't know who they belong to. They're going to come into you in a wide variety of manner. Some of them might come in via email, some might be physically mailed to you. So then you're kind of left scrambling to try to figure out like, okay, well, who is this person? Who is it for? And then how do I start to combine it with the actual grantee? So at least with Reviewer, we've got a pretty cool workflow that I'll show you over here where the applicant can actually put in who their reference is, and then it can trigger a notification saying, hey, Susie, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Kyle, click here to do so. And then again, to continue that theme of providing a very modern, engaging experience, they actually enter a reference portal. So one of the kind of best practices here is to try to avoid reference letters. I find that more times than not, a letter is a better reflection of the writing ability of the person who's submitting it, not necessarily who it's for. So how do you not penalize a grantee because their reference was poorly written or waited to the last minute? It's also a pretty heavy lift from them. So instead, in this example, they're actually asking the person doing the reference to rank the applicant on a series of qualities that they're looking for. You could also instead say, hey, what are 3 short form essay prompts you want their references to answer? That way, when they submit it, you're creating tremendous consistency and you're comparing apples to apples because every grantee or applicant has the same data associated with them. So Kind of moving on, let's see if you have any questions or comments, toss them in the chat. The follow-up to this is going to be organizing deliverables and documents. So again, most of these programs are going to have on average between 3 to 5 file uploads submitted, and those necessarily won't be submitted right away. Sometimes you're collecting a couple documents now, and then maybe you want people either at the very, very end of it, if they're selected, to come back and submit like acceptance packets or fund disbursement forms. Or if it's a multi-stage program, you go from LOI to full proposal, they're going to come back and submit the documents later on. So how do you create this structure, this workflow where submitting documents is extremely simple? Again, we were very spoiled by YouTube where you can submit gigantic size files that process in the background. And everybody's used to using YouTube nowadays. And so that kind of created like this expectation with how files need to be delivered. It's very, very challenging if they're going to be sending you like Google Drive links that are, not being shared properly. So you have to request access. If they're multimedia, if they're large files, if they're, a file format that we're not used to seeing, like how do we ensure that we actually get it? And then on top of that, like what lives in those files? Do we have budgets? Do we have tax documentation? Is it considered, private information? If that is the case, how do we ensure that the place that it was submitted to is SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, so a very secure private portal, and then two is how do we make sure that we keep that file in that system? Because as soon as you have a application process where you're able to collect highly sensitive information that then converts into downloads, exports, email, you name it, you basically lose all of the initial data security and privacy that we started with, right? So it's basically how do we create like a centralized document management system that isn't standalone, so the files and the uploads live with the application. We obviously want it to be cloud-based, secure. We want to be able to control access levels. So both versions. So if they're making changes to the files, you guys can see that. The ability to add additional documents or files in the future. And then to go one step further, accessing controls, right? So if I take an applicant profile in that has a form and then 5 different file uploads, maybe 3 of those 5 are more so for like record keeping purposes or for my eyes only. And I don't want the review team to physically see those. If that is the case, how do you unlock and release elements of the application or elements of the profile to your review team without showing them absolutely everything? And I think where the magic happens here is the ability to actually embed those documents into a system. So again, if I'm reviewing for you guys, I'm doing it at 10:30 on a Wednesday and I'm using my iPad. So that creates a very unique environment because if I'm supposed to be looking at a spreadsheet, if I don't have like the iPad's version of Excel downloaded, I probably can't actually download and access that deliverable. On top of that note, is I have to be very efficient with my time. So I want to be able to side by side see the applications. I want to interact with and view the file uploads while side by side leaving comments, notes, and my scores and not have to leave the centralized hub. So with that said, what does that look like? So this is going to go hand in hand with the other example of the application. So you're collecting files within your submission workflow. At that point, you guys basically will get this menu system, or ideally you have some version of this, right? Whereas applications come in, they show up in this menu and you can sort, you can filter, and you can find people. The goal here is if you're using like your jot forms or your survey tools, to be able to view this content, it typically looks like a spreadsheet, right? Where every row is a person and all the columns are the data. For you to make use of it, you have to download, export, and recompile it. At least with reviewer, if I open the applicant up, this is where that profile concept hopefully comes to light. So in this example, I've got Michael, he or she is a submitter, and you can see right away that I've got the entire application that was submitted right directly in front of me. The goal here is to go very old school and take a concept of a binder, but not be physical and try to virtualize it. So I've got Michael, basically his cover letter or his content. Off to the right, I've got direct communication tools, either directly communicate one-to-one with the applicants and or internally with your own staff. Those internal comments and those internal notes get logged on their profile, but the applicants themselves can never see it. Now, what I really want to look at are those file uploads. So in our system, you basically have a section called attachments. And you don't need to worry about this because every single document that gets uploaded, either by you, by the applicant, or by whoever else, gets automatically logged into this section. Because each one is its own line item, it also gives you permission controls. You can see, control who can see it, what they can do with it. You can track audits. So for example, if they're modifying the documents, you can see that. But then better yet, if I open a file up, and press view, it actually embeds the deliverable directly in front of us. So this could be a 45-page PDF, it could be a video file, it could be a photo, it could be a budget spreadsheet, you name it. We don't care. We create consistency. So no matter who you are, what device you're accessing this from, we can ensure that you're going to be able to physically view those files and interact with it while side by side, doing whatever you want with it. Comments, notes, scorecards, you name it. It also makes it very simple that if you have a multi-phase program, it does allow the applicants to either fill out additional forms or they can come back and add more file uploads, and you can get kind of triggers and notifications when that's happening. I also want to kind of allude to one last element here, which is the supplemental form section. We're going to come back to this later on when we talk about impact tracking. But at least initially, the goal here is that you might have your applicants submitting more content to you throughout the kind of life cycle of the program. And so, great, you use this platform to collect applications. You got this operational command center, but now you have all these random documents and these random submissions being sent to you somewhere else. Then you have to figure out like who they belong to and then merge them together. So in Reviewer, they can create additional forms that get logged on their account. So in this example, it's a reference, right, or a impact report. And then when I click view, it actually shows me what was submitted. So going way back to the beginning and why this concept of a profile is so critical and how it actually sets the stage for everything else is that once we have a profile in place, that profile will just grow and grow and grow and literally holds on to all the content and all the activities that pertain to the applicant and their journey. So the next thing that we're going to kind of look into is designing the review and selection workflow. So this is my favorite topic to talk about. We'll spend probably the rest of the conversation here on this. And the reason why I say that is it's incredibly important because there's kind of two things that come in play. There's one is the operational overhead of taking these applications as they come in and building these review workflows. And then two is actually conducting the review and selection process, right? So as far as like the challenge that we're faced with, I think for many of you, you're basically taking applications in and then you have to figure out, hey, how are you going to get those applications into the hand of the review team? And then if you start to layer on additional components to that, like how do you redact PII from the review team? How do you not overwhelm them by saying, hey, go look at 100 submissions. Instead, I want you to look at just these five. If that is the case, how do you decide which five they're going to look at? As you're doing the review and as you're doing the scoring process, like, do you have a structured scorecard in place? Are you a data-driven organization, or is it more of like a deliberation, subjective review? How do you mesh both worlds? How do you empower the review team to at least have like a consistent experience where every one of them has some type of like raw rudimentary guideline of like what they should be evaluating on? If we're going to talk about scorecards, how do you then avoid having all these scorecards being sent to you and then you mainly having to take every single one of your judges' results, running formulas and merging it with the rest? Or maybe you have like a shared spreadsheet that all of the review team log their notes on. How do you avoid them letting notes and scores from other evaluators potentially impact how they did the review or having them break the spreadsheet, right? Anytime you have a shared document that's kind of floating around for multiple people to interact with, it's very likely at some point someone's going to do something that they shouldn't, and it kind of ruins it for everybody else, right? And then the last piece to that I talked about earlier on is if you've got like a team of evaluators, they're not all going to have the same judging tendencies, right? So like I, for example, may be more strict than somebody else. And if that is the case, how do you not penalize the grantee that unfortunately got me as one of their evaluators, right? And that's not a bad thing, right? You want your review team to have kind of like different kind of thoughts and ideations around how they score people, but you want to, because you selected them for the reason, how do you not start to let that bias affect the overarching results? So what we're going to look at here is what I call like review buckets. So it's a way for you to take your applications as they come in and then start to segment them out. So in its core, that creates like a consistency. It allows you to build these workflows. And then on top of that, how do you start to layer on those judge assignments? And then how do you actually conduct the review and selection? So I'm going to bounce back into reviewer. And one thing we didn't talk about a little bit, I'm just going to show this to you, is from an operation perspective, the beauty of having these profiles being submitted as well as having the built-in judging and scoring mechanisms is that it basically creates these command centers. So you have a one-stop shop to literally manage the entire grant lifecycle from application all the way to reporting. So for you, what I would do if I'm structuring a review process is I want to take a step back and look at like what is the workflow of your grant? Is it a one grant offering, right? So everybody applies and you're going to decide who gets funded. Do you have multiple grants? Do you have types of projects being submitted? Do you have high volume, which requires us to have a multi-round review where you take like the top 150 submissions and then narrow it down to like the top 50 and then narrow it down to the top 20. All of those kind of workflows are going to decide how you configure this. But at its core, what we want to see happening is we want to create a bucket. And that bucket has two things. One is it has applicants, and the other is a team. When that team comes in, they review only the applicants within their bucket. So in this example, we've got like 6 or 7 different types of grants that we offer. So using those personalized experiences, as I, as the applicant, choose the Kirby grant, as soon as I submit, I get automatically put into that bucket with all of my other applicants who apply to the same opportunity. From there, I can start to fill up my bucket with a dedicated team. So whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark come into the system to do a review, they're only going to see the submissions in the bucket that you assign them access to. This also works really well. So for example, if your team is actually reviewing all of the applications, that's great. You just put them into all of the buckets. Or maybe your buckets are a little bit different. It's initial review, phase two, final selections. You can also start to layer them on top of each other. So again, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds of how to structure a reviewer. What I really want to talk about though is the assignment process. So your goal and kind of your takeaway is to take all of your applications, segment them, put them into buckets, and then figure out who from your team or who from your volunteer staff you want to help with the review. Once you have that in place, you can either unleash the applications to them, or one of my best practices is to leverage randomization. So some of the data that we have suggests that on average, most volunteers really can't look at more than 15 to 20 grant applications. Now, that's going to be very dependent upon the data being collected, how robust it is, and how comprehensive your selection criteria is. But if that is the case and you assign somebody 35 submissions, like it's very hard for us to ensure that the same energy was given to number 35 as it was to number one. So if that is the case, or if you've got just large volume, how do you take your applications and then equally and then randomly divvy it out to your team for review? So in our system, if you open these buckets up, it's actually going to show you two different lists. One is all of the applicants in that bucket, and then the other is who your potential staff is. So using simple math here, I could say, you know what? I just want to make sure that every grantee gets looked at 3 times, no more, no less. With that said, I want to make sure that my team isn't looking at more than 20 people. So you can actually take your applications, bulk select, and say, let's just give everyone to 5 people or to 3 people, whatever those numbers are. And then within reviewer, it's going to take those applications and equally and then randomly assign them out. So the whole judge pairing process is becoming very automated. If you ever wanted to override that and make your own personal changes, great. You just edit the judge's name and say, you know what? I don't want Mark to review Gabrielle, so I'll just uncheck her name and then reassign her to somebody else. So this was previously done via spreadsheets, right? Or your guys' kind of handwritten notes on paper, but we're pairing up applicants with reviewers. Now, the most important aspect of this is the review, right? So how do we elevate their experience? So the goal here is to create, again, each one of these systems plays with one another. So applications come into a dedicated hub. That hub has all the operational aspects to it. That hub also allows you to pair people up. And that's what makes the review selection process feasible, because now I never have to download, I never have to export, I never have to ship off these packets to my team. I just say, hey, Mark, come into Reviewer and begin your review, or whatever platform you're using. Again, if you sent them to Google Drive, Mark's going to come in. He or she will probably see a folder, right, for every single one of your applicants, has to access all the deliverables, log their comments, log their notes. In this experience, the review team just simply comes in. They can see a list of either people or IDs that you want them to evaluate. Again, I would highly recommend redacting data. So if there's any content that you're collecting within your submission experience that could potentially negatively alter the review's perception of them, and or if it's data that's not relevant to the review because it's like for record keeping purposes only, just don't show it to them. So the review team simply clicks on the profile, and then you have this integrated side by side. So the idea is that they can be doing this on their mobile device or their computer at 5:30 or 10:30 at night on their couch. And they can kind of side by side, scroll through the applicant profile. They can read the content. They can look at the short answers. They can look at the essays. And then off to the right, they're filling out like a formal review scorecard. So I have a personal bias towards data-driven results. I'm not naive that a lot of times you're going to deliberate and you're going to talk about the results, and sometimes the data doesn't tell a whole story. That's totally fine. but we at least want to have a starting place, right? So the goal is to have your review team come in and answer a series of scorecard questions that do two things. It aligns to your mission and your vision, and two is it aligns to the data that you collected during the application experience. So again, they just kind of side by side independently review the content, answer a series of questions. They can jump up to the file uploads. They can see a list of whatever documents you granted them access to. If they open it up, it actually embeds itself in there. They can leave notes. They can review additional forms that were submitted. But the goal there is if it is a data-driven scorecard, you never have to worry about either A, them doing their tabulations, or B, you tabulating for them. The system will actually read the results and build out what I call a leaderboard. One other kind of best practice or bonus tip here is a lot of times we talk about rubrics and scorecards, which again, I'm a huge proponent of. However, I don't necessarily want to see your team allocating points. What I mean by that is, say, for example, this question is like, how does the applicant plan to measure the success of their project? Rank them on a scale from 0 to 20. Number one is that's going to take the team a lot longer to do. Number two is that they're going to kind of get bogged down in the numbers. Like, well, what's a 16 versus what's a 17? So for me, I like to offer like an emotional response. So from like poor to great, like how does this applicant demonstrate how they're going to measure impact? And generally speaking, their initial emotional response is the most accurate, highest quality. And two, it's going to save them a bunch of time. Now, behind the scenes, we still can allocate points to that. So below average might get 1 point and above average might get 5 points. You also may want to consider weighting your scorecard. So there might be certain kind of criteria or parameters that you guys want to emphasize on. You can add a weighted average in those as well. Now, again, the beauty of it is nobody has to get bogged down in the fine details. Your team just simply comes in here, they read the content, and they answer questions. That's it. They're in, they're out. Their entire judging experience is going to take them 30 minutes, right? Which is incredible because they're volunteers. Now, from your perspective, as soon as this gets submitted, you get these leaderboards. And these leaderboards are going to be used in a lot of different ways. Again, it's data driven. So basically it shows you every applicant. It shows you how each individual evaluator ranked them on a per person and collective basis, as well as gives you averages. So what you can do here is you can either say, you know what, this is a multi-phase program. My goal is just to kind of narrow the results down to the top 20. You could bulk select the top 20 and at the bottom move them to phase two, phase three, final selections. For some of you, you might be very data centric, and this is the results. That's great. You can just pick your recipients from here. Or maybe you want to use deliberation. So you pull this up and your team kind of talks about all the applicants. You talk about how they were scored. Maybe if somebody wants to make a very compelling case for somebody else, you can kind of shuffle this. And then maybe your granting isn't like a selected or not selected. It's okay. When you're selected, now we have to allocate you a certain dollar amount, right? Because you have a fund. So here's where you can start to then say, okay, Leslie's going to get, X number of dollars, Sheldon's going to get this many dollars, right? And you can start to append the selected amounts for each one of them. One last kind of thought here is the normalization of results. So I mentioned beforehand that I love using randomization where you take your applicants and then pair them up with their team equally and randomly. The downside to that is you're not controlling who's reviewing who, and not every applicant gets reviewed by the same people. So in this example, I can kind of see it happening here. Mark gave Sheldon a 12, but Judge Judy gave it a 31. That's a very big difference. So my first question comes in is like, okay, did Mark just score Sheldon low because it was a low quality form? Or what if Mark has never given higher than a 13? So by his own standards, he scored Sheldon very, very good. However, compared to the other judges, Sheldon was scored very, very low, and that's going to negatively impact the overarching results. So what we can do is we can start, and I'm not going to get too deep into this now, we can offer these reports that basically shows you on a per applicant basis, per judge basis, how they scored on each individual question. Once we know this, and again, the system will do this for you automatically, it basically will show you trends. And you can kind of see it here in green that on average, Judge Judy scores about a 24, but Tony over here scores about a 34. So on average, everybody that Judge Judy scores is almost a full 10 points lower than Tony. So now that we know that, what do you want to do with it? For me, I do nothing, right? I don't care if Judge Judy gave it a 24 or if Tony gave it a 34. What I actually see happening here is Judge Judy scored that applicant as her average. Tony scored that applicant as his own average. So you can start to normalize the results by comparing individual judges' averages versus one another. This is super deep in the weeds. We're going to kind of stop right there, but the end results look kind of goofy, but it basically says that, hey, based on these results, Elon scored a 0.82, which means he scored 20% lower than the collective average, whereas Tony up here scored just higher than, 100%, right? So higher than the overarching average, and that becomes the results. So you're not penalizing people for being short-strawed, by getting a tough judge. You just kind of are measuring their own personal averages. So the last thing I want to talk about is extremely important. It's called measuring impact. So this in itself is actually very, very simple. However, I think almost all of us have this challenge is how do we kind of go back to our stakeholders and to our teams and say, look, we set out on this mission, we are providing funding for these opportunities, and here's the real impact that those dollars had on either people, communities, or organizations. And the reason why that's challenging is you don't really have a way to collect that information back from the grantees on how the funds were used, who you funded, and the raw tangible metrics that they had. So I'll kind of just leave it at that. I'm going to show this to you. But the only way that you can do this is to lower the barrier for the applicants. Once somebody is awarded a fund or they're selected, the idea is to have some type of automated sequence where they come back and do some self-reporting every 6 months, every 1 year, whatever that looks like. And what they're reporting has to align with two things. It has to align with their initial project proposal and your own mission and vision, right? And so if you say, hey, so and so, we're going to give you a $20,000 grant, like what are the key performance indicators that we can hold you accountable for? And then you couple that with like your own personal mission of like, is it fixing low income housing? Is it providing research to cancer, right? Whatever it might be. And so these are the type of metrics that they're going to come back and self-report. Now, once they self-report, now you have unlimited capability and unlimited power because you have all of your applications, you've got all of their profiles, you have their initial content, you've got the judging and scoring, you've got who you selected, you've got who you funded them for. Now you have all of their ongoing data that they submitted to you. Once you have that, you can generate an infinite number of reports that looks at averages, who was selected, and then the actual outcomes of those projects. So the best practice here is number one, and this is the most important best practice to measuring impact, is lowering the barrier for participation. Without the grantees doing these self-reports, it is physically impossible for you to measure impact, right? So lower the barrier, make it super simple for them. 6 months after receiving a grant, they get a text message with a link that says, click here to submit your follow-up survey. Click on the link from their phone, answer a series of questions, boom, they're done. We also want to automate this, right? So for some of you, you've got like an ongoing grant process where you've got net new people applying. You've got some people who are currently in review, and you've got some people who 4 years ago got selected for a grant and they're now still collecting data from them. You have to be able to kind of segment these applications and these profiles out into whatever their corresponding workflows are. So to show you how simple this actually is, if you remember this example, if I go back to viewing the entries and I jump here to the end, um, I am going to go ahead and say there's a drop down here. So if I am Michael and I am the grantee and I say, hey, it's my 12-month follow-up, I can come back in here and I can click add new. In fact, I'm going to jump over to this example over here. So I'm going to click add new. And then as soon as I do that, the system is going to ask me, well, what is it that you're trying to add? Sorry, let's use this example. And in this example, it's a scholarship acceptance packet, but for you, it might be your grant reporting template, it might be your impact tracking, whatever you want to call it. The goal there, though, is it's a predefined list of deliverables that you want from them. As soon as they select it, boom, it just pops up. And so they start to say, okay, well, here's my project, here's how much money I received, these are my dates and deadlines. This was my initial stated goal. However, here's the actual outcome. Here's an explanation of the discrepancies between them. Oh, and by the way, you asked me how I was going to hold myself accountable. Like, what are my KPIs? Here's what my targets were versus my actual qualitative and quantitative impacts, how the funds were used, right? Did you spend all of it? Is there ongoing funding needed? Like, how sustainable is this? Do you have updated budgets? And then, like, what is the game plan for like the next quarter or for the next year, right? So everything that you see here is going to be highly customizable to what you want to connect from the applicants. This goes back to your why, right? Why are we launching these programs? What impact do we want to have? That will impact what data you collect in the application, as well as what follow-up data you collect from the grantees. Once you have your why, you can build out the forms, and then it becomes as simple as them just coming in, clicking submit, and then boom, they're done. Now from here, that's when you can start to aggregate data. So you can build out these dashboards, you can visualize them, you can put them on your web page for your communities to see. Like the opportunities at that point are completely endless. But again, to reiterate, the only way that this works is a very low barrier self-reporting mechanism from the grantees. So With all that said, I went a bit longer than what I hope to do. I hope, again, that there's at least one small takeaway from today's conversation that you can take and apply to your programs. If even one of you has that, then I consider this a very successful conversation. But with that said, what other kind of questions can I answer? I'm happy to talk about reviewer. I'm happy to talk about best practices. If any of you are facing certain challenges, both operationally or just in general about your grant making process, I'm very fortunate to work with thousands of grant makers. And so I like to think I've seen virtually everything. These are some of my ideas of challenges that we're facing, but I could have been completely wrong. And if you have a challenge that you're hoping for me to talk about that I didn't address, now's your time to toss it in there. There's also, a fair number of people here. So if you guys, want to offer feedback or insights, by all means, please do so. But I will hang out for as long as you guys want. Again, my goal is to provide you as much education, resource, and value as we can. Not naive that for some of you, you might be exploring platforms like Reviewer. If that's the case, I would love to see it. I'm happy to have those conversations. For others, you have a well-oiled machine. I also love to see it. And if there's anything else, let me know. So I'm gonna go ahead and mute myself and grab a quick sip of water. But like I said, I will hang out for as long as you guys want. And I think there's a few people dropping off. So yep, just toss in any questions you have in the chat. Yeah, and all the comments, saying this was helpful and thankful. Again, that's my number one goal, right? Um, we built Reviewer because we in ourselves were volunteers. We're mission driven. That's why we were volunteering our time. We got kind of fed up with the process, not necessarily from the inefficiencies of it, although they were quite inefficient. It was more so like, how do we as a volunteer allocate our time to these organizations, trying to serve these giant missions and not seeing the fruits of our labor actually have raw, tangible impact, right? And so we built Reviewer as a way to kind of systematize these processes. But at the end of the day, what gets me very excited is we can kind of see in real time emerging trends, best practices, and insights from our clients that we can hopefully share with you, and vice versa, right? You guys are on the front lines. If you're seeing things that you want to bring us in on and make us aware of, I'm very quite certain between our staff, our clients, and kind of our expertise within the space, we can find you resources. So I appreciate everybody's kind of attendance and also your participation. We will follow up likely this week, still either tomorrow or Friday with a recap. What we're going to do is we're going to convert this into like a blog post, so it'd be very easily digestible. We'll give you clear, actionable next steps and insights to apply some of these concepts as well as the recording. So kind of keep an eye out for that. But again, I will hang out for as long as you guys want. All right, looks like most people are starting to jump off. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you so much and keep an eye out for that follow-up. Have a good rest of your week.